Y really likes tickling cat corpses. They get 8 pleasure points from it. Okay, so last time we were introduced to the first moral theory that we're going to consider and discuss and criticize in this course, and that was utilitarianism. And we also saw that utilitarianism is composed of 3 sub-theses: hedonism, aggregation, and consequentialism. Those were the 3 sub-theories or sub-theses that make up the larger moral theory of utilitarianism. And remember, hedonism and aggregation, at least, they aren't moral theories. They're theories about other things. Hedonism is a theory about what's good for individual people. It says pleasure is the only thing that's good for individual people. That's hedonism. And aggregation is a theory about what makes a whole outcome or a whole circumstance good. And its answer is, well, you just add up how good that outcome or circumstance is for individual people. You just add. That's aggregation. Anyway, what we're going to do in the next few weeks is we're going to get some arguments against each of these. 1, 2, 3. And we're not even going to start with that today. Today we're starting with hedonism, but we're not getting an argument against it. We're going to get that next time, an argument put forward by philosopher Robert Nozick. Before we get to that, we just want to understand Jeremy Bentham's own version of hedonism. What exactly he has in mind when he says that what's good for a person is pleasure and what's bad for a person is pain. And we got that answer in the one paragraph that was the reading for today. It was just one paragraph, and now we're going to talk about it. Okay, this is the first sentence of the paragraph, the one paragraph that we read for today. The utility of all these arts and sciences, I speak both of those of amusement and curiosity, the value which they possess is exactly in proportion to the pleasure they yield. This is a statement, a rather general statement of hedonism. Let's go through the sentence and see that this is a statement of hedonism. The utility of all these arts and sciences. What are these arts and sciences? Well, we don't know because we're just reading one paragraph and this is the first sentence of the paragraph. But we can take arts and sciences to just mean, in this case, human activities, things that human beings do. The utility of them, their usefulness. And he's going to explain what he means by utility. He just glosses it after this inserted clause. He glosses it as the value which they possess. So the question is, how good are these activities? How worthwhile are they? How valuable are they? And by the way, when he's talking about these activities, he's talking about activities that amuse us, that they're fun, like playing games, for example, right, or sports, and activities of curiosity, right, like, you investigate something in a scientific manner or in an artistic manner, maybe. You do it not because it is entertaining, but because you're drawn to do it. For some reason, you want the knowledge that it will result in, this scientific or artistic endeavor or whatever, right? Okay, so we're talking about all these kinds of behavior, the value which they possess, how good they are, how worthwhile they are, is exactly in proportion to the pleasure they yield. Right, so how good they are is determined by how much pleasure they result in. Now we're going to get a more specific statement. The next sentence, or next couple of sentences, is going to tell us really what Bentham has in mind by pleasure. Okay, the next sentence says, every other species of preeminence which may be attempted to be established among them is altogether fanciful. What does that mean? Okay, every other species of preeminence. So species of preeminence in this case just means kind of betterness or worseness. Something is preeminent if it is, in the relevant sense, better. right? And a species of something is a kind or a variety of that thing. So Bentham is saying that what matters is pleasure among arts and sciences, among activities, right? Pleasure is what makes them good or bad, the pleasure that they produce, the pleasure that they result in. And any other way in which you might try to judge some activity against another activity, right? Any other difference between two different activities, right? So let's say one activity is, basketball. There's your basketball. One activity is basketball, and one activity is, visual art, like painting. Here's the tree and the sun and like a lake or something. So these are two activities. There's painting and playing basketball. Bentham says that the only thing that would make one more valuable than the other is how much pleasure they produce. How much pleasure does engaging in this activity produce? And how much pleasure does engaging in this activity produce? If you want to know which is the more valuable activity, you just figure out how much pleasure they produce, and then you pick the one that produces more pleasure. And here he's saying every other species of preeminence which may be attempted to be established among them, that is, any other way in which you could compare them. You might say, well, art does some other lofty thing, right? Like it puts you in touch with the cosmos and humanity itself or something like that, whereas basketball doesn't do that. That's a difference between the two, maybe. Bentham says that doesn't matter. It is altogether fanciful. That other difference between the two, that one of them puts you in touch with the cosmos and the other one just doesn't put you in touch with the cosmos, right? Whatever that means. That kind of difference, if it doesn't have anything to do with pleasure, then it's altogether fanciful. Like, it doesn't make a difference to the value of these two activities. Okay, that's what that sentence means. It means that the only thing that matters in determining the goodness or badness or the value of some activities is pleasure. And in the next sentence, we're finally going to get more of a clarification of what exactly Bentham means by pleasure, or what he has in mind when he says pleasure. Okay, so I actually wrote up two sentences, and these are famous sentences. Here's what he says. Prejudice apart, the game of Pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. If the game of Pushpin furnish more pleasure, it is more valuable than either. Okay, what does that mean? Prejudice apart. So that phrase is just being used to mean that, well, look, once you put your prejudices aside and look at this objectively, right? So we have certain prejudices in that we personally like some activities, some arts and sciences, better than other activities. You may like art more than you personally like basketball. But we're trying to figure out which activities are more valuable, not just, for you or something like that. So put aside your own prejudices. Prejudice apart. The game of Pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. The game of Pushpin. I don't know what Pushpin is. It's some game. It involves a pin that gets pushed into something. The point is, it's some very, very simple child's game. It's simpler even than tic-tac-toe or something like that. It's a very simple game for little children. And it's not interesting to adults, typically. It is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. Music and poetry. Bentham's point here is, look, once you put aside your prejudices, so long as these activities, music, poetry, fine arts, right, so long as they produce no more pleasure than these more mundane activities like sports or like a very, very simple game, well, if that's the case, if they don't produce any more pleasure, then they're no more valuable, even though they're sort of fancier or more lofty, or thought of with greater esteem in our society, or something like that. If the game of Pushpin furnish more pleasure, it is more valuable than either. Than either what? Well, than either music or poetry. If someone gets more pleasure out of playing some simple child's game, then that simple child's game is more valuable in this circumstance than music or poetry is. We learn something from these sentences about how Bentham is thinking about pleasure. He's thinking about pleasure as something that comes the same from simple games as it comes from lofty activities. So Bentham's version of hedonism is a version on which all pleasures count the same so long as they are of equal degree. If you get a lot of pleasure from Pushpin, but it's kind of like Pushpin pleasure, it's not as fancy as music or poetry pleasure, Bentham thinks it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the degree of pleasure that is produced. Then, and I actually think we're not going to read the rest of this paragraph here in this lecture, then Bentham goes on to just bash poetry. He just says a bunch of mostly irrelevant stuff, irrelevant for our purposes at least, in understanding his version of hedonism, mostly irrelevant stuff about how poetry sucks. That's what happens in the next few sentences. I mean, that all goes to the conclusion that we shouldn't think so highly of poetry. But Bentham's overall hedonist view, where the degree of pleasure is the only thing that matters, well, that's compatible with poetry producing lots of pleasure or poetry producing very, very little. Anyway, you should go back to the reading. It was only one paragraph long, and I've already explained the first, 4 sentences of it, right? These are the crucial 4 sentences. Go back and read the next few sentences, and you'll see Bentham's just bashing poetry for a little bit. Okay, so now we've got a grip on the version of hedonism that Bentham is advocating. It's the kind that doesn't care about the source of the pleasure, it only cares about the degree of the pleasure. We're going to get an attack on that version of hedonism next time. But before we get this attack written by some other famous philosopher, let's see if we can attack it ourselves, sort of on the fly. Let's see if we can come up with some objections. So the kind of objection that I want us to try to produce right now is a specific kind of objection to a philosophical view called a counterexample. Okay, what is a counterexample? A counterexample is a kind of objection to any general claim. And it's the kind of objection where you give one example that proves that that general claim is false. So here's an example of a general claim. Grandmothers have gray hair and give out hard candy. That's a general claim. It's a generalization. It's a blanket statement about all grandmothers. They have gray hair and they give out hard candy. You know, like little sucking candies. They give them to kids that they see, that they meet, that they think are cute. Hold on, I have a candy for you in my purse, that sort of thing. This is a generalization that you might make about grandmothers. You could object to this generalization. You could disprove it. You could show decisively that it's false if you gave just one example. One example of something that meets the first condition, that is a grandmother, but that doesn't meet both of these next 2 conditions. You just need one example of a grandmother that either doesn't have gray hair or doesn't give out hard candy. Or it would be even better if this grandmother didn't do either. That would be a counterexample. One example that goes counter, goes against the generalization. So what's an example like that? Well, I think Whoopi Goldberg is a grandmother. Is that true? I don't know. Who is a famous grandmother? A celebrity grandmother. There's got to be one of those who doesn't have gray hair and doesn't give out hard candy. Maybe this celebrity grandmother is young, so young that her hair hasn't turned gray, or maybe she dyes her hair. then it wouldn't be gray, right? And she doesn't give out hard candy because that's not her thing. This, it turns out, is just a stereotype. It's just an inaccurate generalization for a whole group of people. And to disprove it, you only need one single example. That kind of example is called a counterexample. Now, let's try to produce a counterexample to this claim that Bentham made. Prejudice apart, the game of Pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. Well, actually, let's not produce a counterexample to that. Let's produce a counterexample to the more general idea that the only thing that matters for the value of some action is the degree or the amount of pleasure that it produces. What would a counterexample to this sort of claim look like? Well, it would be one example that makes mention of two actions. We'll call them action number 1 and action number 2. One of the actions would be very valuable, more valuable than the next action, even though the first action has a lower degree of pleasure that results from it. Right? That would be a counterexample to this claim. If we could find actions like that. So can you think of some action that maybe produces a lot of pleasure, but that we think is not as valuable as some other action that produces less pleasure? Here's an example. Let's start with a base case that's like very simple. Someone, a person, call that person X, right, eats ice cream. They eat some ice cream. Let's say that it gives them how many pleasure points? Let's say it gives them 3 pleasure points to eat this ice cream. Then let's consider some other scenario. In this other scenario, a different person, call them Y, goes and finds the corpse of a dead cat, a cat that died of natural causes, some other way. They find the corpse of the cat and they just sort of like tickle it a lot. Tickles cat corpse. Remember, they didn't kill the cat. They didn't hurt a cat at all. They didn't hurt anyone. They just found an already dead cat, and they're very committed to this. They only deal with cats that have already died of other causes. And they tickle them, and they love it. Y really likes tickling cat corpses. And so Y gets, they really like it. They like it more than a normal person likes ice cream. They get 8 pleasure points from it. And both of these people do these activities in private. They're not advertising this to anyone else. It doesn't have any significant effects on anyone else. There's one less ice cream on the shelves. That doesn't really make a big difference. And there's one less cat corpse in the world. That doesn't make a huge difference one way or another. According to Bentham, this activity, right, this art or science, is more valuable. It has greater utility than this one. But you might think, maybe you think this, and maybe this is just your prejudices coming out. Maybe you think that, no, there's something else about this. It's not just the degree of pleasure that matters. It's like whether it involves some weirdo thing with dead animal bodies where you tickle them or something like that, right, and cackle to yourself. Maybe you think, no, there's something that counts against this action other than, well, the amount of pleasure and pain that it produces. I mean, this action, strictly speaking, doesn't produce any pain at all, it seems. If you can convince your audience, your interlocutors, that actually A2, action number 2, is less valuable than action number 1, then you've produced a counterexample to this, a convincing counterexample. This counterexample is only as convincing as the intuition that this is more valuable than this. Okay, so this was my example, my attempted counterexample to Bentham's claim or the claim that's behind what Bentham has said. Now you try to produce your own counterexample.